David Scott.
Hi.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Kate.
I feel like this is both a long time in the works and also something that just came together so quickly.
Yeah, but look where we're at. Isn't this like the coolest place to be? You feel so comfortable and at home here.
Feels so nice. Our host, our sponsor of this series, Alchemy 48, incredible space. So you and I, well, why don't you refresh my memory and everyone's and just briefly remind me, how did we originally meet?
Well, you came to one of the events that we were doing for work. So we were bringing the community together to talk about, I don't know, various topics that were of interest. And sometime around a year ago, you showed up at one of those. And I think you made a really cool decision in your life once you were there surrounded by all that support or that group that we had there, which I didn't realize at the time. But for me, really brings me a lot of joy to know that the things that we're doing catalyze those kind of relationships and all that kind of stuff that comes out of there. So, we met through that. And then when I realized that you had this passion and drive for bringing the community together too. So I'm just so stoked to be here and starting this podcast and having some really fun conversations and great guests and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So this project, we've titled it Between Us, which I think is wholly appropriate. And I think this really stemmed from a conversation you and I had when you shared with me that you have this upcoming opportunity at a conference. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was asked to speak at a women's conference. And of course I just said, yeah, sure. Like, how hard can it be? That's usually what goes through my head. And I don't think twice about it. I know it's a challenge that was meant for me. And then later I start going, okay, what am I going to talk about? And so I knew that I needed to reach out to people that I could trust with a conversation who's sensitive as, I'm the only guy that's involved as a speaker for a women's conference. And, how do I treat that conversation with respect? And most importantly, as I was starting to examine what I wanted to talk about, how do I not just say what everybody wants me to say? Because I think that would be super easy. I could bring the house down, kind of feeding into maybe some stereotypes and tropes and things like that that may not be fair. So my thought was, how do I have more of a challenging conversation with women from the perspective of a man about how we've been communicating with each other?
Yeah. And I think that led me down a path where I realized, man, I'm listening to all these podcasts and all these experts in the space of feminism and masculinity. And sometimes I think a lot of those words, especially now, just get kind of tossed around as fun buzzwords and sound bites. But then I started sharing with you some of the data and all of the themes that I was hearing and experiencing. And so you and I just kept kind of leaning into this conversation about the relationship nowadays between men and women. And I think it's important too to preface this entire series with, this is not a podcast about gender in the sense of we're focused really on masculinity and femininity, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And not to say that there's one right way of doing it, but really, to start to understand what is driving the relationship between us and the dysfunction around it. I started to look at some of the things that I was just doing and kind of considering normal and natural, that was adjusting how I was going about my day, just because I didn't want to make women feel uncomfortable because I know how I look. And that had started to become just a natural, normal thing in my life of, oh, I see you were in the aisle in the grocery store and I'm going that way too. I'll circle around and come back because I'm going to the same area. And I just don't want you to feel like here's this, big galoot standing next to you. And and that came from stories that I was hearing from my wife about how people would bother her, guys would bother her when she's out in public, even with our kids, and, say things like, you just have such beautiful hair and, like all this just creepy stuff. And I never wanted to be that. So I went to the opposite extreme of saying, well, I guess that means I don't talk to women if they're strangers, right? And I just kind of wrote that out of my life. And I just don't think that's good either.
Yeah, I like those extremes that exist. I think you and I both try to operate in the gray area a little bit, or at least recognize that there is a gray area, and nothing in my mind is set in black and white, but I feel the exact same way on the other side of it. So for me, I know, especially at this point in my life, I'm a 35-year-old woman. Everyone around me, I felt like, has been pressuring me to become this like gung ho vocal feminist in whatever their definition is, right? And so as soon as people start inviting me to hop on a bandwagon, I immediately go, something something here is off. So I think you and I have both recently experienced such extremes in other people's perceptions of us and expectations of us, which helped spark the conversation that we just keep having over and over.
Yeah, and it was important for me to recognize that people were responding to the way that I was doing masculinity in a positive way that I wasn't really aware of, but that was starting to impact the way that I was building culture in my team and how those relationships were forming, how the bonds of trust and all those things were, it just by me being me. And I wasn't really understanding that masculinity had a component to how those relationships were being developed. To kind of sanitize gender out of the workplace and not really been open to a conversation about how men and women function differently at work, out in public, all that sort of thing. We're wired differently, we communicate differently, and I think the tendency was to highlight those differences and say those are bad without really having a conversation about what makes masculinity a good thing, what makes femininity a good thing. And I was afraid to use the word feminism because I didn't feel like I had the right to it. And that's an interesting thing to observe, is like, I feel a bit shut out of that conversation, and that's my perception. It's not because anyone has ever told me that. And that's why I think it's important for us to explore these things, is because if you start thinking about it, you probably weren't told exactly word for word, you need to do this, or you just have this background of this feeling, right? Like men have to be a certain way, women have to be another way. It's just sort of like this, the spirit of the age, right? And when I started to examine my own behavior, I started to realize, like, I don't even know what that's coming from. I can't tie that back to a specific experience or someone telling me this is what you need to do. It's just sort of learned as you age, as you just have life experience.
Life experience, and I suppose too, in today's day and age of technology and content flying at us a million miles a minute, I know I feel like I've just been exposed to, I guess, so many different definitions of masculinity and femininity, which is great, but I feel like it has eliminated the opportunity to have s- a safe place to have this dialogue, which is why I'm so grateful to be able to have it with you in emotionally safe space like this. Because online, if I were to go on and question something about, hey, the way you're defining feminism to me doesn't really resonate, or if I wanted to point out something about toxic masculinity, who knows, the trolls of the internet are going to tear me a new one. And that, brings me to another thing I know we're both passionate about, is the younger generation. So you and I at least are adults and can try to navigate this to the best of our ability. But I know we're both equally concerned about the generations that are coming up. And I don't have kiddos. I know you do, but any thoughts around anything?
I always wanted to be a good dad. I never wanted to let my kids down, and I wanted to do right by them. And I get this feeling like I got to teach them something. Like, what am I going to say to them that's going to stick in their minds? And they go, okay, dad said that. And really, there's nothing. like they model the behavior that they see you do. And I just an image flashing in my head, probably from 6 or 7 years ago, where my daughter, who loves drawing pictures for me, she drew one of those. Here's a stick figure of Daddy. Here's a stick figure of Isla. And there was this little bubble coming off of my head, a speech bubble, and it said, "I am so proud of you." And I know that's what resonates more, the I love yous and putting my kids to bed and showing, and both my wife and I showing how we handle conflict with each other, how we resolve that, how we come back together as a family, and not to create this sort of feeling like family is disposable, that it is always safe, even when there's a storm cloud on the horizon, even when there's something that's, that you need to work on, that it's still safe and nothing bad is going to happen. And as I've watched my kids grow up, as they're 12 and 10 now, the security that they've had from having a dad in their life that's not putting pressure on them to be a certain way, especially when it comes to their own masculinity and femininity, but let them explore that themselves and have their own identity that's not being shaped into something that's really not them. So I've just, I've tried to not be very self-critical as a father, but just have the reflection of them back at me be the gauge of, am I doing a good job with that? Am I being a good man, a good father, a good husband? Because what they see is, and how they act in their own lives and how they treat other people is a direct reflection of what they learn at home.
Do you think that you would be as empathetic and self-aware as you are if you hadn't had kids?
That is such an interesting question, because I'd like to believe that all of it is just in me. But the way that it gets pulled out to live and breathe and be in the real world sometimes comes from things that are extremely challenging to get through. And, with our kids, we have been blessed, but in particular, the circumstances around how my son was born were pretty scary, were pretty challenging. And still to this day, it's like, 10 years later, pulls a lot of emotion out just to remember. And, you get through that, but you start to understand, especially with how politically charged a lot of conversations are about um, family planning and, a woman's right to choose and all of these sorts of things. It's like, I don't know if you live it with and understand other people's experience, then you could have a much different perspective on that and be much more compassionate and not so quick to say that everybody who wants something has bad intentions about it. And I think that's where we're at in the conversation between men and women, is that the trust is at a level where everybody's kind of fighting for territory, and we don't realize like we belong together as men and women, both, with our spouses, with people of the opposite gender that we work with, that we see each other on the street. Like, we have roles and responsibilities to take care of each other in certain ways. And when we're antagonistic between one another, or you look at me and you go, oh man, tall guy with a beard, looks like he probably has these types of political leanings, and you'll be absolutely wrong, by the way. No matter what it is that you say, you're going to be wrong with those assumptions and say, like, I feel threatened by him. And then from my perspective, I'm like, yeah, just another person who just completely ignores that I even exist because they look down on me in that way, right? And you get desensitized to it and you sort of block it out. But on a case-by-case basis, it could be hurtful, but then the light comes on in your brain going, no, you're a man, you're tough, like you don't care. And so you push that down, right? And that's what, our guys are trained from a young age to suppress all of that and just suck it up, be tough, get your job done, and, nothing hurts. But that's not necessarily true.
And that leads to kind of one of the bigger themes of one of the episodes we're going to record with a guest about really kind of the evolution of masculinity and expectations of men. And you were just mentioning the idea that men, not so much of the ones that are coming up right now, but let's say men of your age and perhaps older, there's this expectation that you have to be tough. You have to be the provider. You have to be. And the pressure that comes with that must feel insane. Like I can't relate to that at all. I've never had anyone look at me in my life ever in any type of relationship and have that type of expectation. I put other pressures on myself, but never that one. And I recognize the irony as I'm saying this out loud as a woman that I'm the one calling attention to this, because people in my life are going to hear this and go, this is the girl that was always joking about like ignorant middle-aged white men and blah, blah, blah. Like that's language that I use and have used fairly frequently. And I know for me, I was losing empathy for my fellow man and some individuals in my community. And it probably had to do with some of these expectations. And yeah, that's I think for me, one of my personal goals with this podcast is some self-reflection and challenging myself, because I would like to think that I'm super self-aware and empathetic. I at least try to be, but I know I've lost sight of it in some ways over the past few years.
This isn't your normal sponsorship ad. This episode is brought to you by our friends down at Alchemy 48, our favorite speakeasy in downtown Mesa, Arizona. I sat down with their bar program manager, or as he's better known, the director of discretion, Brandon Becker, for a conversation. We talked about craft, community, and why a great cocktail might just teach you something about being human. Pulled a few of my favorite moments from that conversation, and I hope you enjoy them just as much as I did.
I think it's difficult for a lot of us to recognize those among us who actually make life worth reflecting upon. And so I think that being a communicator, even if it's in reflecting others, is, like you said, a superpower. And I was talking to a friend the other day, and they're a young person, which I don't necessarily see this a lot, especially in the younger people, maybe because I'm old, I don't know. But they're actively listening to me at a bar, music up, drinks in hand, listening to me. And I'm like, I stopped myself because I can just go.
Yeah.
I stopped myself. Brother, that is your superpower, because that makes people bond. I can chatter, you can chatter. I don't know if you walk by a group of people sitting at brunch and realize that out of 1,000 words, they've said nothing and heard maybe even less. To be able to listen to someone and understand what they're saying or their intent, or even just learn from their body language, however it comes, that is a superpower, to be able to take something outside of yourself and then make it part of your knowledge. And that can sound really selfish, but if we're all doing it, then we're all improving whatever our self is.
Yes. Also, am I just now in this moment realizing the definition of the word speakeasy? Like creating a space where it's easy to speak to people in an intimate.
I'm glad that
Is this
you
happening?
said it out loud.
Is this happening right now?
If I were to do
35 years later.
If I were to do it, it might seem pedantic. But no, I love that you came to that, because you can't explain that to people. They have to experience it.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I love our off nights is because I can have real conversations and people can speak, and it's wild. I work in one of the pretty rare circumstances in which I speak to strangers every single day.
Yeah.
And we live in our fish bowls. We speak bubbles to each other, but none of it makes it out, and none of it really matters, right? We're not gaining anything from each other. So I think that people in the service industry, if we take the opportunity, some of us just do our job, but if we take the opportunity to recognize the power that comes from interacting with strangers, and if you can make that meaningful,
your team.
Yes.
So I don't know them at all.
Sure.
I know you
Right.
for the amount of today's conversation, but everyone seems like they truly care about showing up and coming to work.
Yes. Everyone here.
I just wanted to comment on that because I think sometimes the service industry, food and beverage, bars, they can get a bad rap.
Yes.
And as someone who's worked in that world, for good reason. Sometimes there's restaurants in certain spaces you don't really feel proud or excited to show up at. But it seems to me that you have an incredible team that wants to be here. You serve a lovely product, and your customers thus far being pretty cool.
Most of us, the ones that are here, we part of it is a labor of love. We're doing it for each other, and or we're doing it for the craft, and or we're doing it for the people.
Yeah.
For some of us, this is our social life, if you will.
Ooh.
And when we reflect, I see it starting to be reflected back now from our clientele.
Yeah.
Whether it's the same people who come back here to get more of not just the cocktail, but like interacting with myself, interacting with John, being able to, sit in this comfortable environment and have a different, different music, different atmosphere, different feels, different conversations, right? The speaking being easier, if you will. I'm already seeing that.
Yeah, there's things that just get into your blind spot, and you don't think twice about them, and I sometimes I feel the same way. I look at, especially in a corporate environment, how power and influence is distributed around, and I do question that too. And then I go, well, it benefits me, so how do I work that out in my head? It gets complicated, and that's why we should talk about it. Because it's good to have a conversation, and I hope that we disagree on things, especially, I would love that, because that's the whole point. I mean, it's not to, especially like as I remarked earlier, like I'm going to be talking to a room full of women, and if I just said all the things that they wanted to hear, then I'm wasting their time. We're never going to make any progress unless there's a degree of discomfort that's involved with that.
What do you think in this pretend speech that you're not going to give that would wow everyone and go over super duper well? What are some of the highlights that you think that room of women wanted to hear or would react well to? Fake speech. This is not the right thing.
Yeah, I think that would be, expansion of the talk that I gave last year about masculinity and strength, where upon reflection, I kind of presented myself as more of like this ideal with a character arc who is past all of those problems from the past, and I'm totally squared away, comfortable in my masculinity. I never make any mistakes anymore, and there's never any flashes of like, it's not the right way to do it, dude. And that's unrealistic. And I think the challenge is how authentic can I really be in that conversation to really put the context together of, what drives me and how I've hired an entire team of women and why I think that's important. And it's not just because it's a cool story to tell. It's because like I really did genuinely value each one of those team members. And on some level, it had nothing to do with whether they were women or not. It was because I could count on them. And I could trust them. And I knew that they shared the values that we were building our team off of. And I want to go back to something that you said earlier about, men's roles as providers. And I have a pretty strong take on this, and because I think that it absolutely is to be a provider, but a lot of guys mistake what they're supposed to provide for material things. You get this a lot. I work all day to provide money for this family, so that entitles me to A, B, C, D. And that devalues the contributions of anyone in a relationship that isn't able to hit the kind of numbers that you do. And a man's role is It could be to provide financially, and certainly that's common. But what we're supposed to be providing is the emotional security for our family to grow and thrive and prosper. Because, if it was true that a man was supposed to provide financially, then all rich people would be happily married with no dysfunction in their household at all. But actually, it's just the opposite. So I think that gives you a clue that that's not it. So me working all the time to make money for my family, and I never see them, and I just go, that's good enough, right? That's providing zero for them, especially in the limited time that I have with my children. And when the children leave the house, like, okay, now what with my wife? Oh, I'm sorry I neglected the relationship for the last 20 years. I've just been at the office. That's not going to work either. So, but that doesn't mean that we aren't tasked with a responsibility to provide, because we absolutely are. But we just need some coaching on what we're supposed to be providing. It's anyone's responsibility if they're sensing that there is conflict that's not being resolved and it's getting worse and you're drifting apart and the relationship suffers, to first of all look in the mirror and go, what is my part of this? Because I've heard a lot of stories, but I have never heard a story where there is one right and one wrong 100% both sides. Now, I've seen some that's pretty skewed towards one or the other, but most of the time, if both parties or more were to do some self-examination and get their ego out of the way, and maybe this is why guys fail at this a little bit more frequently than women, is because the ego tends to be a bit stronger when it comes to admitting that they're wrong. I could stand up in front of a room full of women and I could highlight the end result: broken families, abusive relationships, all that sort of thing. But it doesn't acknowledge the roles that we both play on everything that led up to that. And I'm not discounting anything. It's like not really where I'm going with that. I'm just saying when it gets to that point, it doesn't happen overnight. In a lot of situations, there's lots and lots of things that lead up to that, and we haven't done proper self-examination, getting counseling, all of the sorts of things that we should be doing. That means that there's a mismatch in priorities.
I would completely be remiss if I didn't take a moment to ask you to do some type of PSA for men, specifically heterosexual men, for therapy.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. Get into the therapist's office. It is not that big of a deal. Yeah, you're going to be talking about how you feel and, how your mom treated you and all of that stuff. That's normal. But going about your day every single day, cramming all your emotions down, you know where that ends up. You explode at some point and you do something that you're ashamed of that you can't undo. So if you're not finding an outlet to be able to explore those things, then you accept the consequences of how you're managing your own emotional well-being. And I don't know of a single guy that doesn't have actual emotions,
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. And they're the same identical emotions that women have. We're not completely different in that regard. So it is so damaging, I think, to sell men that you just got to suck it up every day and get it done. And you can't take any time to focus on your health, be that physical or mental health.
And I want to be super fair to the gentlemen out there. That was also a PSA for me, because I'll be perfectly honest. I know that I typically present as the one who's super comfortable talking about anything and happy to chat about trauma, bonding, all that stuff. I think I've seen 6 therapists over the years, not a one stuck, hated every single one of them, felt super uncomfortable, and entirely like me issue, not a them issue for the most part. And it took me quite a few tries to find one that I felt like challenged me enough in the way where I could still hear it, right? I wasn't just like uncomfortable and shutting it out, but I felt like I could share and be vulnerable. And guess what? That therapist kind of looks like David. Ironically.
Well, that's a weird dynamic now.
I know.
Yeah. Well, that's good because I think, you reinforce these things and you start to shift away from the behavior models that are not working. And, it's important for all of us, not just young people, to realize that the internet is not the real world. It isn't. And the heat that you thought this conversation was going to have about masculinity, femininity is conditioned upon how it's perceived on the internet, which is rough. The comments are pretty brutal. But I've found it to be just the opposite in the real world. Whenever I've talked to women about this, they have been so open to it. All over the feminism spectrum, too, from ones that were pretty hardcore feminists, and had some, some things in their life that had shaped their feeling that way. So I kind of understand how that's protective. But they were willing to engage in that conversation with me, which leads me to believe that we shouldn't be that afraid of it because people are uncomfortable. They want to have a safe place where we can do this kind of thing because women, a lot of times, and these are direct quotes that I'm getting back from women that I've asked this question to about, what's not working. And it's like, I can't, as a career woman, I'm having to be in my masculine so much that I never feel feminine. I never feel soft like the way that I want to. And I want guys to be that. And then I see the guys, they're too soft and they're not expressing masculinity in a healthy way. And this makes me like really kind of ponder, like, what does that mean? What is that feeling about, being kind of out of balance with yourself? Like as a guy where you just really don't feel like a man, and, or as a woman, like you feel like you're having to be in a role that you never really signed up for because the men in your life never stepped up and did their part. So you had to compensate for that.
Yeah, that so many thoughts racing through my brain.
Let's hear 'em.
My partner, most patient man. He is like, why is every stranger just a friend you haven't made yet? Why do you have to be nice to everyone? You don't need to be nice to everyone. You don't have to assume the best in others. But that's just like my own self-preservation, I think. And it's for me, it's not for the other person. But I absolutely am doing work on myself this past year on how do I draw those boundaries and how do I shut people down? I've had calls with you. I just remembered. I reached out to you about a client and a situation and realized, yeah, that's not going to fly. I got to set that aside. I've had conversations with a female mutual colleague that we have where I asked her for some advice and she goes, I'm in my 40s and I literally still don't know how to deal with this. So it's, I don't know where I was going with that particular tangent, except that I can sense I'm very frustrated.
You're not alone. I can absolutely assure you of that. And that's the type of conversation that I didn't want to have with a room full of women because yeah, you all have your stories there and you're all absolutely justified with saying, I cannot trust men because the stakes are too high if I get it wrong. If I make the wrong judgment call with a guy, this could be one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. And I hear you, dude. I'm sure you're a great guy, great father, community leader, whatever, but I cannot take that risk with you. And so no matter what my intentions are, pure or not, we're never going to find out. And I understand. So that's why that conversation has to be for the men. And in particular, why are we not regulating that type of behavior, not from a government perspective, but from a cultural perspective to say how wrong that is and that guys have to hold themselves to a higher standard of behavior than that and not abuse the advantage that we have because of our physical strength, because of, our social position or whatever. And don't get me started on how unbelievably frustrating it is where everybody, and this happens to families too, takes the side of the guy when it's absolutely something that awful or abusive that he did. And they go, well, the woman must have provoked it or something like that. Shouldn't address that way or whatever. Like, I don't know. I'm 45 years old. I have never had an instance where I was like, you know what? I think I'll just physically assault this person because, like, what's she gonna do? People will believe me. So how do you get to that point? And so as a guy, when we say we're protectors, how do we protect women? Because are we truly standing up for that type of behavior, or are we letting guys off the hook when they do it? And, having people in leadership positions that are not held to that kind of standard of taking care of their family, raising their kids, doing all those things that we consider in our country, in our society, to be morally the right thing to do. And then you're going to look at women and go, well, why can't you smile more? And that kind of bullshit.
David, there are two moments in my career that just flashed before my eyes. One was when I was in a sales position and my male boss, told me to smile more on the phones. And it took everything in me not to strangle him with the phone cord. The second one was I was a leader and I was negotiating with a vendor over the phone. This very East Coast direct, I don't mind the vulgar language, obviously, but I'd always been mostly fine with this guy, but I knew how to handle him. But one day something was going wrong and he pulled up, well, sweetie. And when I tell you, I was the quiet, angry, just, you will hear every single word I'm saying and it burned through the back of your head. And I remember my boss at the time, he kind of lifted his head over the call center wall and was just like, are you doing, you don't get involved. I don't need another one of you involved. I've got this. But yeah, those situations happen all the time.
Yeah, I had a similar situation that happened to me when some guy called me son. And that set me off. This was a long time ago, but I still remember it. And without even thinking or stopping, when he said that to me, I was like, I am not your son. Two people on this planet can call me son, my dad and my grandfather. And he didn't like my response because I was probably early 20s or something like that at the time. And, he thought that he should be able to be in a position of authority over me. But that doesn't mean being able to get away with saying whatever you want to say to somebody. That's the misuse of masculinity, to say, I have power and authority over you for whatever reason. So that means that I can get away with treating you however I want. And I don't have to be kind to you. And I don't have to be respectful for you. And that's where we're missing the boat when it comes to how do we express masculinity properly. And all of us nice guys out there are the reason why it's such a problem. That's the burden that I have, right, as a nice guy in the world, is that I have to deal with the consequences of my passivity as a man. Collectively together, we have created this situation.
I mean, part of my challenge to myself in this conversation is to, I suppose, play devil's advocate, because it would be very easy for me to sit here and go, yeah, David, your gender's the fucking problem. Tell them to be less passive. But then I think about the times where I've been in those situations and I've watched other women be in these situations. And sometimes I think it's maybe you just get jaded after speaking up. I think that's an option. You're so tired of having the same conversation over and over, or you feel like if you do speak up, you might put yourself in a difficult or a scary situation. I mean, there's so many reasons why people don't speak up. So I suppose that's worth saying. But yeah, to your point, it's not just a one person or even a one gender, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah. yeah, it's a culture that's shaped by our unwillingness to take a risk in the moment. And when you extrapolate that out across our entire society, then you get what you get. And so, you know, I try to remember how guys were in Mayberry where I grew up, and I never felt threatened physically or any of that kind of thing. That's just, for me, it wasn't anything unusual when it came to that, because kids just, you know, they do asshole things to each other. But when it came to adult men, you know, they were the way that they, I think, should be in that community that I grew up in, where people looked up to them, people trusted them, people knew that if something bad happened, that they were going to show up and they were going to take care of what needed to be done. And
Well, before I go down any more rabbit holes, I want to hear, what are some of your goals and desired outcomes as we continue this conversation over the next 6 episodes?
I really want to show some good examples of people who have healthy viewpoints on all the topics that we're going to cover, and I want to learn some things. You know, the conversation that I'm looking forward to the most, is probably going to be the most challenging for me, is the one about gender, and just not gender roles, but, you know, gender assigned at birth versus gender that is the way that you want to live your life. And I'm not going to reveal anything about my thoughts on that, other than to say that I'm pretty sure that people who are speaking from a different perspective than what I understand will help me learn more, and that will be beneficial to how we have that conversation in the future. And the guest that I'm looking forward to, you know, especially like for our next episode, because I've had these conversations with these folks before, Lloyd Hopkins, Kristen Lena, like they've already helped me to further explore, you know, what is it? It's not just wake up every day and kind of go about your life and then go, what was that about? But really to understand what is driving the way that we feel and how we're interacting with each other. And they've both been great examples of that. And I know that they want to dig into it more for their own personal growth. And I would love for that to happen, like in the context of the discussion that we're having here, you know, in this room. Like that would be so great. Is just to watch us all have some growth in those areas, because we're going to have to get someplace different than what we're at right now. And we don't know where that is at the moment. We just know that we want something better. And I don't want it to be a common experience for you that in your life as a woman, that you're made to feel that way by guys on a regular basis, either like from threats of like violence or belligerence in that way, or, you know, sexually uncomfortable and those kind of things too. It's just like a freaking common thing. And for you online in real life, we've got to do better. So I'm really excited about putting that out there to like catalyze further conversation, and, you know, it's just to see where it goes.
Same here. I'm really excited. I'm really grateful to you, because it's not obvious by the fact that we're doing this. You're one of, unfortunately, I would say, a few men that I've encountered in my life that I would even be comfortable in any capacity spending this time with or having this kind of conversation with. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Well, I didn't really even recognize that in myself until people started telling me, and I still don't have a good handle as to why, because, you know, I can be tough in my own way, and I can with my team, with other people, and yet we still have really strong relationships, because, you know, they always know where they stand with me, and they know that they know where I'm leading them. And I think it's important for us to realize what's working too, in the same conversation about what's not working, and that requires a lot of self-reflection. So, any one of the topics that you're really looking forward to or dreading?
I mean, I'm really looking forward to biology, bias, and the brain, because I have my own story and history with, well, I'll give the cliff notes. I mean, I had a stroke because I was on birth control. I have ADHD. So anything that has to do with the brain, neural pathways, how that's affect me and all of my relationships, I'm totally down for that. And of course, the tie-in to birth control, why I went on birth control, why I'm not going to have kids, all of that stuff. I both am looking forward to that conversation and also a little nervous because of the personal tie-in, which shows me that it is absolutely the conversation that I need to be having.
Yeah, and it's also one of the most politically charged up conversations right
Yeah.
now too, about about women being able to have choice and control and autonomy with their bodies, and um and people's right to choose what gender that they want to be. Like, this isn't right in the crosshairs of the culture war mentality that we have in this country right now. And so it's okay if you don't really want to wade into the weeds on that one, but it's important that we do, because if we don't stick up for people who don't have a voice in this, or are coming at it from a political perspective and not from a humane, compassionate perspective, then people who have the opposite viewpoint of wanting to regulate and control what people do, and govern them to death in the name of some kind of misguided, like, legislative morality, that's what we're going to get. And I'm not comfortable just rolling over and letting it happen, because too many people that I care about are affected by it. And my 12-year-old daughter is at the front of my mind every time this conversation comes up, because I want to do the best for her. And I didn't really, when she was born, have this vision of her growing up in a puritanical society that was oppressive to women. So, that's just not the vision that I have for her. And the way that the wind is blowing in that conversation means that, we're going to have to step up and not just kind of like let things happen as they happen. So I feel like, that's a worthy conversation. And, the guests that we'll bring in will provide a level of expertise and perspective on it, in addition to, our own personal context. So I feel like we'll handle that with dignity, with respect, and I'm looking forward to it.
I think the last piece I'll say is you also talk a lot about just creating the space to have uncomfortable conversations and giving each other the space and grace to have them. And that's probably the thing I'm looking forward to the most, because as we've been talking today, I didn't realize it until this moment, but I'm really tired of shying away from topics. I'm really tired of feeling like I have to edit myself on any spectrum of these topics or these conversations. I just want to be able to talk to people about it and learn and evolve and let them feel like they can too, without becoming a soundbite on the internet or feel like you're going to lose your job or your clients or your right to this. Like, I just want to be able to talk to people.
Right. Without having it be some kind of sterile, sanitized version of yourself. That's really not getting to the point. There's so many conversations that I've heard that sound like it's great content and information, but then when you look at it, you go, well, what's changed? Nothing really has changed. And I think, the call to action, that kind of stuff is important when it comes to these sorts of things. Where are we at in between that?
Well, all right. Well, with that, everyone, stay tuned and welcome to Between Us.